It was unearthed in that committee that a fourth of their budget comes from Medicaid reimbursement. That's $35 million that supports some of our most vulnerable community members. So that would certainly, should that go away, that's a huge loss to our community and something that I think a number of our community organizations would look to the city to help develop a plan for what's our plan to backfill.
Well, that's Seattle City Council member Alexis Mercedes Rink speaking there, talking about potential cuts in federal funding impacting agencies like the Downtown Emergency Service Center in Seattle. With budget issues of its own, does the city have the money to help the people who use these services? That's a big discussion for the council this week. Plus, a ban on cars at Pike Place. Say what? Well, it's sort of happening. We'll go into that. And also take a look at an unfolding investigation of sexual harassment, drinking on the job, and more damning allegations against Seattle City Light. All this and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm joined by my co-host David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, it is great to be back with you after a spring break last week, but I couldn't help but notice, since we went on break, the Seattle Mariners have gone 8-2. They're scoring more than 6 runs a game. I'm not suggesting we go on a break from now through October, but I just think it might be something to consider. I'm throwing it out there.
I know, yeah. It just took my lack of faith for them to turn it around. It's all it really took. Once I was starting to think maybe this is just a bad team, they show me that they might actually be a good team.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Little pockets of hope all over the place. Well, I'll always thank you, David. I appreciate you joining me. Thanks also to City Grind Espresso, the background noise sponsor for the audio podcast on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks always to our show patrons. And remember, patrons get access to patrons first content before anybody else. You even get a cool looking decal sent to you. I've sent out a few of these over the past couple of weeks. Check it out. We even answer your questions on the show. Starting pledge level is just $5 a month. So find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon and pledge your support. Also, a big thanks to Converge Media. The video version of the podcast is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's do this thing. Time for Right Here, Right Now. I wanted to start with a story unfolding in the Seattle City Council's Health and Human Services Committee this week. So the council's trying to figure out what happens now that, due to cuts from the Trump administration, the federal Health and Human Service office that used to serve Seattle in what's known as Region 10 here in the Northwest, it's been shut down. So that means less service in terms of connecting people in need with affordable health coverage, preventing disease outbreaks with immunization, for example, even enforcing civil rights protections. David, the council is meeting about this issue this week, and I'm just left with the question of, now what? Does the city even have the resources to help people who might be left out in the cold with this closure of the federal HHS office?
Yeah, I don't have a super deep understanding of where one agency ends and the other begins, because there's public health at various levels. There's state, county, and federal. But what I do know is that they all seem to be pretty dependent on each other, that they're kind of coordinating. We saw that a lot with COVID. And so, I think removing the federal government from the public health equation is certainly will make things more challenging. I would think, especially on disease tracking and things like that. I don't know the system well enough to say for sure exactly which piece the federal government owns the most. But, I think of the Seattle Indian Health Board. I know that they have a lot of they get a lot of support from the federal government, and that could fall away. So I think it's a sort of chain of different levels of government working together, and one link of that chain is soon to be missing.
Yeah, and this is I guess this is the bigger issue for me, because you'll hear it from the Trump administration. The press release at least is talking all about this. These are cuts that need to be made. Health and Human Services at the federal level had a budget increase of 38% over the last 4 years, a staffing increase of 17%. But I've also seen critics that say this whole concept of reorganization is going to backfire. Thousands of lives really on the line here when you think about it. It's this whole concept of move fast and break things, right? That's the old Mark Zuckerberg quote, and it's a mantra, I would say, of the tech world. Is that really translating into better services? I'm trying to predict the future here, which I know is difficult, but where do you see this HHS situation going?
Yeah, I think what is different about this administration is, as you said, in the past, you have budget conversations, and it feels like, it has been always sort of difficult to cut things from programming because
Sure.
when you have representatives who have all these various constituencies, people are going to fight for that constituency, even if they, are generally supportive of cuts. And so, it just becomes a really long, drawn out process because there's always somebody who's going to lose something when you
Yeah.
have a cut. Even if you can make the argument that it's not the most efficient programming, which I don't know about HHS
Sure.
in this case. But what's different about this administration is they aren't going through any of those processes. They're not,
Hmm.
no one's really because Congress is not particularly involved in these
Yeah.
cuts. So there's no representative going home and sort of needing to explain this to the people who elected them directly. Rather, you
Right.
sort of have this, central office that is making these decisions. And I think that, um, it certainly makes the cuts come more quickly than they would have otherwise. Which, if you want cuts, then sure that you might support that. It also sort of gives it though like a feeling of a lack of accountability, which is, I don't know who's being cut from this. I don't know why they're
Yeah.
being cut. I don't know if they're the right people to be cut. Even if you say a 15% cut or whatever is justified, do we know that the right 15% is
Yep.
being cut? I think the answer is no.
Yeah.
We don't know basically anything about how these decisions are being made.
Yeah, that's one of the most concerning parts of this, and I think that's what the council is trying to figure out too. Is just who are these people that are getting cut? How do we help them? How do we even track them? That data is difficult at best to track down here. I don't think it's happening in a lot of these cases, but I appreciate you breaking that down with me. But I wanted to talk about something that will stop you in your tracks this week. That is, if you're trying to drive into Pike Place Market. So David's colleague Nick DeShays was reporting on this in the Times. Beginning Wednesday, only certain kinds of vehicles can access the market, Pike Place Market, at First Avenue and Pike Street. That would include emergency vehicles, drivers who have disabled parking permits, commercial deliveries, vendor loading and unloading, and curbside pickup for customers who might have placed orders. So the city's doing some road work in this area, is the bottom line. Should be done by August. So they're just calling this a pilot, the city is, to see what life on Pike Place would be like without as many cars. David, do you see this project as a good proving ground for the people who want to see this area car free, or what's it going to take to convince people on this, I guess?
I think it's not going to take very much to convince people on this. I think that, then there's been polling on this, specifically around Pike Place, and it is overwhelmingly in favor of limiting cars through there. The holdup, I think, has always been, it has been oftentimes ascribed to vendor concern, though my experience when I was a transportation reporter and had done some reporting on this was that that was a lot more nuanced than I think it was given credit for. In fact, a lot of vendors, I think, support some changes to the traffic pattern there.
Sure.
What I really think was going on is Pike Place Market is so historic and so important to the city of Seattle. I think anytime leaders, the people who are in charge of kind of stewarding that
Yeah.
are presented with a question of whether or not they should change it in some kind of fundamental way, which is what this would be. I mean, cars
Yeah.
have been driving through Pike Place for 100 years.
Yeah.
Uh, I think they get really nervous about doing that because, their goal is to keep it here for another 100 years, and they don't want to be the ones who tried to make some change and it didn't go well.
Yeah.
Um, that said, I think there were a few things that pushed it toward this maybe finally happening, which is one, the pandemic. There was a lot more conversation around pedestrian spaces and
Yeah.
particularly outside spaces. Um, a lot more people have been dying on the roads, so there's more conversation around safety. Um, and then, Mayor Harrell mentioned this in the State of the City, but that horrible incident in New Orleans on Bourbon Street, where the
Hmm.
person drove through Bourbon Street
Yep.
and killed people, he's looking at the World Cup, and that's going to be a sensitive time for the city's safety. And he's
Yep.
looking at that and thinking, do we really want out of town people in large cars driving through what is going to be an incredibly crowded space?
Yeah. Even if
So
they
there
don't
was
have
some.
bad intent, I see what you're saying. Yeah, they don't know the area, etc.
So yeah, so I think all of that added together sort of tipped the needle on a thing that, from my perspective, the vast majority of people in Seattle want, even irrespective of all those other things. They just
Yeah.
think it would be a nicer experience. But it was always a hard thing for officials to do for whatever reason.
Hmm.
But there have been enough kind of pieces involved that has made this tenable at this point. And
Yeah.
and I thought it was very funny that they couched it also in doing utility work.
Yeah.
I'm sure maybe the work does need to be done, but it does give it a little bit of, hey, we're doing this utility work, so we're just
While
going to
we're
shut it
at
down.
it, yeah. Yeah.
That feels like a little bit of an excuse, but whatever it takes.
Yeah, it is interesting though. But going down a little bit further on that path, there, the Friends of the Market, the nonprofit that essentially is in charge of what's going on down there, and sort of speaks for a lot of the vendors there. It's this idea that Pike Place isn't necessarily this pedestrian space or an event street. You'll hear that phrase thrown around a lot in different neighborhoods when they shut down streets for certain events, etc. They would point out that it's a working market. You got a food bank there. You got several low income residents. You got a senior center, a child care, a medical clinic. So it's not completely a place to hang out either. It's just Pike Place as a neighborhood. I don't think a lot of people process that when they think of that area. Do you?
No, yeah, and I think that's a good point that a lot of the concern about disallowing cars down there, was around basically gentrification of the
Right.
market. And you heard that from people. They didn't want it to be a museum. They wanted it to be lively and active and somewhere where people are actually working. And I think that's a fair point because it isn't just a tourist attraction. It is a place that people in Seattle use for lots of different reasons, even just to go shopping. I love shopping at Pike Place Market. It's
When you
not
can, yeah, it's awesome.
it's not a tourist trap at all. It's a wonderful place to be. That said, I think the argument that tourists in large cars looking for the quote original Starbucks by driving through there, that had some kind of important contribution to how the market functioned, I think always kind of strained credulity a little bit. I think you can make that argument when you're talking about deliveries or pickups or, of course, ADA access. But, you go down there and most people I would bet regret having driven down there. And I think that's what this pilot is trying to do is cut back on the people who are basically there by mistake.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really interested to see how this goes. And this summer, it sounds like it's going to be a very good testing ground. Again, with this closure, at least temporary closure, this pilot project going through August. All right. Up next, the fallout continues from a Seattle City Light investigation that has revealed instances of sexual harassment, drinking on the job, and more. We're going to update you on what's happening coming up next on Now Hear This. As you may have heard late last week in Council Committee, Seattle City Light is trying to respond to an investigation recently made public that showed patterns of sexual harassment among dozens of crew members that included groping, sexual advances from superiors, pornography at work. Plus, there was drinking on the job, forcing subordinates to drink to keep their jobs and carting around alcohol in city vehicles. Here's how City Light GM Don Lindell at last week's meeting talked about what's happening now.
Our focus is on action, which includes preventing similar incidents from occurring at City Light and fostering a positive workplace culture, which includes physical and psychological safety.
David, you reported on this in the Times. We've got 40 people investigated for misconduct. 5 were fired, 7 suspended, 9 received written warnings, 13 received training. Not everybody was disciplined in this case. Some of the people investigated were actually apprentices who were afraid they would lose their job if they didn't drink like their bosses told them to, or things along those lines. But I was just hearing this level of disgust registered by the council. I talked with Councilmember Rink and Councilmember Strauss this week on Seattle Channel about this, both really, really angry about what happened here. Do more heads need to roll, or what do you see happening next here?
Yeah, I think that's the question. I think there's a frustration about this because Don Lindell took this job in 2024. This investigation was ordered in 2023. So it's not, I think it would be tough to blame her for this. And, even Mayor Harrell ordered the investigation fairly shortly after taking office, after complaints having sat there for a while. I mean, the question is, as Councilmember Kathy Moore had pointed out, there were complaints in 2017 that basically said exactly what was in this report. And so there are certainly questions about why those didn't lead to more introspection on the part of Seattle City Light. They say it was basically because they were anonymous complaints and it was hard to follow up on them. But, that's not to say that they shouldn't have raised flags. And I think there were ways that this could have been looked at. And so, I don't know whose head would or should or needs to roll necessarily, but
Yeah.
certainly I think there are outstanding questions about how a culture like this not only could have been allowed to kind of foster, build and grow, but
Hmm.
that there was documentation that it was existing and nothing was done about it.
Right, right. And that's the thing that I'm concerned about too with this, because I really noticed Dawn Lindell going to some lengths to indicate this is a process that's going to take some time. As much as everybody would like to see discipline handed out immediately, she really noted that there were larger issues of culture change that are going to take a while here. And I know that phrase culture change gets thrown around a lot. I've heard it so often looking at police departments too, including the SPD. Can you get to that point there? What kind of culture change is needed at Seattle City Light? What's it going to take to make that happen?
Well, there's the one kind of glaring piece which I don't know how you fix on it. It's not really a city light thing. It's just a utility thing, which is that there are just very few women in these roles, and so for the women who are in these roles, it's can be a difficult place to work. Um, but as far as the drinking goes, my sense is it that there wasn't a lot of oversight or accountability of the people working. They talked about how basically supervisors weren't visiting their sites very often or
Yes.
checking in very often, and so it was just kind of this good old boys club that had been allowed to sort of operate without a lot of oversight for a long time. And so
Mm-hmm.
you can only do so much to change the quote culture, but you can add on layers to sort of check that culture doesn't grow into something as toxic as this has been.
Yeah, that's going to be the challenge for Don Lindell. And I do know a lot of council members, including Councilmember Rink, who oversees that committee on City Light. They're going to stay on this, and I think this is something that's going to unfold over the next several months here. And interested to see how she leads that charge there, because I think a lot of council members are looking for some more answers here. Certainly, members of the public are too. All right, I did want to move on and talk about a few other matters on the city docket this week. The mayor is calling for a new focus on environmental protections with the celebration of Earth Day. And he's also calling for a new and increased education levy. David, we touched on this a couple of weeks ago that he was looking for some more dollars. Now we know how many dollars. Let's talk about this. What's he looking for? What does this mean in terms of the levy burden that taxpayers are going to face in Seattle?
Yeah, so this will be he's proposing a 6-year, $1.3 billion levy,
Mm-hmm.
which is large in its, I think the levy before was 7 years, 619 million.
Right.
So, in absolute dollars, it's technically double the last one. There's inflation, so it probably wouldn't actually work out to being, literally double, but close to double the last one, and in shorter years too. So it's they're spending a lot more every year on this, and the thing that it really focuses on, I would say the cornerstones of these levies are the preschool program that the city
Mm-hmm.
runs.
Yep.
Um, about a third of the money that they're proposing here is going to go toward either preschool or daycare,
Yeah. Childcare.
childcare. So it's
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
heavily focused on the youngest children. And then there's a lot of money on kind of supports for kids in K-12 because it can be lost sometimes, I think, to general public, but Seattle City Hall, Mayor Bruce Harrell, Seattle City Council do not oversee Seattle public schools,
Right.
but they can fund and are proposing to fund sort of peripheral programming on that. So it's
Mm-hmm.
healthcare centers in public schools, mental health supports, after school programming,
Right.
that sort of thing. And then it also would continue to provide free tuition to community college for anybody graduating from Seattle high schools.
Yes. The
So it
Promise program. Uh-huh.
yeah. So it does a lot of what the current levy is already doing, but is just proposing it, continuing to do it, and doing it more and expanding all of these programs.
Right. And I think it speaks to me too about, I was talking earlier about the different federal cuts that are happening here. We've seen a lot of people scrambling with, okay, Head Start, maybe it's on, maybe it's off. With the different legal proposals and appeals that are going on right now, maybe this is a program that continues. I really feel like this is a levy that so many people have supported in our area over the past several years. And maybe they don't really make the distinction too much between, oh, the Seattle Public Schools is putting on this levy rather than the city of Seattle putting forth this levy. They're putting, at least voters, as the way I see it, are putting two and two together in that, okay, we're trying to help school kids. Great, we're going to do that. Do you see that ethic at work here? Because I don't know if a lot of people really look at those boundaries in the same way that you and I do when we're reporting on these different agencies.
No, I think that's right. And particularly, when you're talking about, yeah, because again, I mean, this is focusing on everything around education and childcare, or just, child rearing that Seattle Public Schools does not. But, for a family who has kids, they, their daily lives sort of move through these programs and
Oh yeah.
schooling in a more fluid way. So no, they don't are less likely to know when they are uh, you know, in something funded by Seattle Public Schools versus in something funded by the city of Seattle. So it
Yeah.
probably doesn't matter to them, but from a financial perspective and a political perspective, it does matter to an extent.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going to be reporting on this, I know, over the years here, but do you see, or the next couple months and into next year, but do you see Seattle voters pushing back on this? I know we've been over this. Seattle voters have never seen a levy they didn't like, but we are in such an uncertain economic time right now. Do you think we're going to see some added pushback when people look at this price tag of over $1 billion and, something that is going to be double what it was before?
Yeah, again, I will doubt a levy when a levy fails. And
Mm-hmm.
so far, since I've been covering Seattle politics, no, I don't think a single levy has failed. Um, every time a levy comes up, there's some conversation around, is this
Sure.
levy fatigue? Is this going to be when the voters break? I'm skeptical. That's not to say it's not worth pointing out that the last three levies, I think, that Mayor Harrell has proposed, well, maybe not last three because we're including democracy vouchers,
Yeah,
but
right. Mm-hmm.
in the last few years, he has proposed three levies that are over $1 billion,
Right.
between education, transportation, and
Mm-hmm.
housing.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
Good
those
point.
are big numbers.
Yeah.
They used to be that the city kind of carried one really big levy. It was usually transportation was kind of the
Mm-hmm.
most expensive one.
Yeah.
So the fact that all of them are now scaling up to that transportation levy is um, notable. Does that mean that voters will reject it? I doubt it because they have not yet. But at some point, sometime in our lives, I
Mm-hmm.
imagine voters will reject a levy. And it could be this one, although I will believe it when I see it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I always like to go through that question because I know it's going to be an argument that a few people bring up as this is brought through the council. All right. Well, thank you for that, David. I wanted to talk about something coming up next year. As a matter of fact, something that's going on in the Utilities Committee for the Seattle City Council, one of those small stories that might turn into something bigger. We're going to talk about it on What's Next. David, this is one of those smaller stories that I think could be bigger. I wanted to talk to you about this. Something the Seattle City Council's Utilities Committee is looking at, a plan to create a more equitable situation for developers when it comes to utility hookups. Here's what's up. The committee's looking at a report this week that shows that depending on the existing utility systems in front of a property, a development may only pay a relatively small connection charge to the water fund because the water main is right there. Builders pay into that to maintain the system. But then you look a few blocks away for a similar kind of development that may be required to install 100 feet of water and sewer main at a cost that would be about 50 times the cost of the water connection charge. So bottom line, what's happening here, here's what the city's considering. They want to increase the price of the SDC, the Systems Development Charge, and hopefully that increased revenue will reduce the burden on developers as the city puts that money towards installing more main lines in the city. Had to get that all out there. But David, what do you think of this legislation? I thought it was interesting because I see the equity argument, but I wonder how it might change where and how projects are built in the city.
Yeah, it's new to me. I had not known that
You have
that would be
not
an issue.
plumbed the
It makes
depths, is the
sense.
line you were looking for. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect. Um, and so, yeah, I can understand the motivation here. And particularly if you're a developer, that could be frustrating. How this plays out in real time, it's sort of the, Nancy Pelosi, we've got to pass it to see what it does.
Yeah.
And so that's where I'm at. I guess, like I said, intuitively, it makes some sense to me that you'd come up with a system where you kind of cut down on the variability in development, especially at a time when the city's sort of trying to get people to develop.
Yeah.
But this how big of a barrier this is to development, or what this opens up, I don't know.
Yeah, it's one of those pieces that you could change to see if that is one of the many different blocks for developers right now. And just to touch on this briefly, the pessimistic revenue forecast that the city heard, the council heard a week or so ago, talking about just the sluggish nature of people wanting to invest in anything. The stock market's going all over the place recently. Are people wanting to invest? Are people looking to make developments? I guess I'm trying to figure out if this is going to be one of those pieces that helps increase construction, helps increase that kind of tax revenue for the city, because I think that's a big piece of it. Construction revenue, in terms of those sales taxes, has been really going down for the city, and that's a big concern for Seattle.
Yeah, it is a concern. I don't know that something like this is really the thing that makes the difference, because we're talking about. I mean, the city brings in money from a lot of different places.
Right.
Really, its main sources are three places, which is jumpstart tax, the sales tax, real estate excise tax, and business and occupation tax.
Right.
You can kind of tinker around the edges on some of the other kind of revenue sources, but if those three things are not doing what they're supposed to, then there's not really any way around it being a bad budget season.
Yeah, just last piece on that budget forecast. I just didn't hear a lot of good news there, and it sounds like there may be some economic forecast later on before the city does its own budget process, before the mayor does his proposal, before the city does the council does theirs, that might shed some more light here. But what kind of trends are you looking at there? It just seemed very gloomy when the council was talking about this recently.
Yeah, it is gloomy, in part because they adopted the pessimistic forecast,
right?
Which I don't remember them doing before, and I think that's reflective.
It was pandemic time was the last time I remember it.
I think that's reflective of kind of the national environment, in a lot of ways. So I guess the best case scenario for the city is that calms down and they can revert back to the baseline. I think the trends at the local level have been going on long enough that I would be surprised if there was some kind of quick reversal in the city's fortunes. But I could see a scenario where, the forecasters look at, whatever, the trade stuff calms down, whatever it might be, and the forecasters look at it and say, okay, maybe we can kind of revert back to our baseline projection, which is, it's still not great, but instead of a 240 million gap, it's more like 100 million in that range. So that's much more manageable. That, I think, is probably the best thing that the city could hope for. But more likely they're going to have to kind of go through the same exercise this year that they did last year.
It sure seems like it. And just the whole idea of getting an accurate forecast. How do you do that when one day, hey, tariffs are in place across the world, and then the next day, oh, we're actually pulling back on that, but wait for it 90 days from now when we take the pause button off. I mean, just getting accurate data on this is going to be a huge challenge. So yeah, from a city's perspective, from a state's perspective, from a county perspective, call it what you will. I mean, national economists are having trouble with this too. So definitely something to look out for with the Seattle City Council over the next several weeks, and we'll keep an eye on that for sure. But David, I do need to wrap up with you. I wanted to ask you this question because I think having this discussion with a few different Seattleites, I want your input. Finish this sentence. It's spring when we finally get more than one 70-degree day in a row, or what do you think?
Well, I think Seattle is usually has about the most ambiguous spring of anywhere in the country. You're never quite sure it's spring, although it's been a very nice spring so far. I go with
from David's first album, Ambiguous Spring. Keep going.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. Well, the daffodils, I don't know if the daffodils count. Because I guess the cherry blossoms, I don't know, maybe that's that's the signal of spring.
Okay, that's a good sign of spring. I know when the moss starts to overtake the grass in my yard, that it's probably about that time. I've often said that my moss has a serious grass problem in my yard, and it continues once again in 2025. But David, thank you for sharing that with me. Thank you for joining me as always, and thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to patrons who support the show. Really appreciate you. If you are not a patron, why don't you become one? Pledges start at just $5 a month on Patreon. Would be greatly appreciated. Thanks so much. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen. We are there. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. Appreciate that. And we will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.